A powerful black female CEO arrives in a small town to establish a research facility, only to encounter immediate suspicion and hostility. Local officials and police not only attempt to tarnish her reputation, but resort to underhanded schemes, false accusations, and even baseless detention. Many in the community seem to tolerate, if not condone, an undercurrent of racism and abuse of power simmering just beneath the town's polite facade. Marisol tightened the collar of her coat as she stepped out of the taxi and into the early morning chill. The hospital's glass doors slid open soundlessly, and she entered, carrying the weight of her work and her conscience into the polished lobby. She'd been here countless times through medical school rotations, long residency shifts, but never with her heart this heavy. It was the first day of the nurses' strike, and the corridors hummed with a tension as palpable as a fever. Inside, the fluorescent lights highlighted every detail. Patients lined up in the waiting area, some pale and quiet, others restless. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air. Normally, Marisol would find reassurance in these familiar hallways. But today was different. The staff locker rooms were half empty, and the hush of understaffing pressed against her ears. The administrative offices upstairs, where decisions were made that trickled down to every bedside, felt impossibly distant. At the nurses' station, her colleague, Dr. Thompson, glanced up behind him. A junior resident flipped anxiously through patient files, charts were stacked precariously on the counter, and a few interns hovered, unsure where to stand or what to say. Normally, a team of veteran nurses would be here, orchestrating patient care with quiet efficiency. But management's recent cost-cutting measures had pushed the nursing staff past their breaking point, leading to strikes, picket lines, and tearful goodbyes. "You heard about the settlement offer?" Dr. Thompson asked under his breath, masking his concern with feigned casualness. He fiddled with his stethoscope, trying to appear calm. Marisol nodded. "I read the memo before I came down. Management's calling it a fair deal, but none of the nurses are buying it. They know it doesn't address the patient load, the mandatory overtime, or the inadequate supplies." She paused, her voice dropping. "They want real change, not a patch-up job." A patient's cough echoed in the hall, a reminder that health crises didn't pause for labor disputes. Marisol recalled the conversation she'd had yesterday with Rosa, one of the head nurses who had helped guide her through her residency. Rosa's eyes had brimmed with frustrated tears as she explained how unsafe staffing ratios endangered patients, how the hospital's bottom-line mentality forced nurses to choose between a patient's comfort and the next one's immediate need. Marisol remembered how Rosa's voice caught when she said, "We're tired of shouting into the void." She ran a hand through her thick dark hair, her shoulders tense. She knew that the official line from administration painted the nurses as unreasonable, difficult professionals. But after years working side by side, Marisol understood the truth. These nurses were heroes under siege. They held the patient's hands, checked the medications twice, thrice, and stayed long past their shifts because they cared. Now, with them missing, the system's cracks were on full display. Dr. Thompson cleared his throat and shifted his gaze toward a patient bed in the corner of the ER. "We're short on everything today. Staff, supplies, even IV tubing. The procurement budget was slashed again last month." Marisol closed her eyes momentarily. She'd worked at this hospital because it was supposed to serve the community's most vulnerable. Instead, it felt like a fortress of bureaucratic stone, where compassion and cost-saving measures collided headlong. She wondered how the board members would spin today's events in the media, how they'd disclaim responsibility even as patients suffered. When her eyes opened, she spotted a nervous figure near the entrance. He was a boy of about 14, standing awkwardly next to his grandmother, who looked exhausted. The grandmother's shawl was threadbare, and her eyes carried shadows of sleepless nights. They were waiting too long. Marisol could sense it. Without the nurse's steady triage, patients were stacking up like dominoes. Stepping away from Dr. Thompson, she crossed to the waiting area. She crouched beside the grandmother, offering a gentle smile. "I'm Dr. Alvarez. How long have you been waiting?" The woman's voice was soft and worn. "Since before sunrise. My grandson's been coughing all night. I think it's his asthma." Marisol's heart tightened. Under normal circumstances, a triage nurse would have already seen them, reassured them, started a nebulizer if needed. Now it was all bottlenecked. "Let's see if I can help," she said quietly. Behind her, the sterile order of the hospital wavered under the weight of human need and corporate indifference. In the distant offices above, executives debated balancing sheets and policies. Down here, in the trenches, people suffered in limbo. As Marisol guided the grandmother and grandson toward an empty exam area, she knew she was stepping into a battlefield where patient well-being fought a daily skirmish against profit margins. She had no idea that in the coming hours, she would confront not just the failings of a broken system, but also a deeply rooted prejudice within the hospital's hierarchy. Soon, she would be forced to decide how far she'd go to stand by what was right. For now, the day had just begun, and the crisis was only beginning to unfold. Talia Carter stepped out of the driver's seat of her jet-black Tesla and paused beneath the awning of a small roadside diner. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, and in the distance, a lone highway stretched like a chalk line through fields of dry, brittle grass. No one would have guessed that the slender woman in well-worn jeans and a plain white blouse was the CEO of one of the largest research tech firms in the country, let alone one that had secured billions of dollars in grants and investments over the last decade. She didn't dress like it, didn't flaunt it. Her accessories ran toward the practical: a stainless steel watch with a scratched face, flat shoes comfortable for long drives, and no flash of designer logos or diamonds. Standing beside her car, Talia lowered her sunglasses and surveyed the scene with calm detachment. The diner's neon sign buzzed overhead. Dolly's Kitchen. Letters half lit, some flickering, like an old story that couldn't make up its mind about how it should be told. She could have chosen to meet her contact at a polished restaurant closer to the city, but that wasn't Talia's way. She preferred quiet corners where real conversation could breathe. Today, however, it was not just her preference. There'd been whispers that the local council, which was reviewing her company's bid to bring a new research facility to the area, had insisted on something informal. A place where everyone could feel comfortable. She'd picked Dolly's to show her open-mindedness. It was neutral ground, or so she hoped. Sliding her sunglasses into the neckline of her blouse, she walked toward the entrance. Her reflection in the diner's glass door showed a tall, poised black woman in her early 40s, dark curls pinned back, a faint line of worry etched between her brows. She looked more like a concerned neighbor than a mogul who guided strategic decisions in boardrooms with world leaders dialing in from 3 continents. That's how she liked it. Let people underestimate her if they wanted. It often played to her advantage, but here in Greenbridge County, she suspected the underestimation came from a darker place, one that had more to do with her skin color and her womanhood than her wardrobe. The door jingled as she stepped inside. The smell of bacon grease and coffee grounds enveloped her immediately. Booths covered in vinyl upholstery stretched along the walls, and a collection of truckers and local farmhands hunched over plates of eggs and hash browns, talking in low tones. A radio, tuned quietly to a country music station, hummed along. The chatter dimmed for a moment as eyes drifted toward Talia, some curious, some guarded, a few warm and welcoming. Talia made her way to a booth near the window, where the late sunlight caught dust motes in a gentle swirl. As she sat, she noticed a young waitress, freckles, carrot-colored ponytail, hovering near the coffee machine, unsure whether to approach on the other side of the diner. An older man in a brown sports coat and a straw cowboy hat peered at her over the rim of his newspaper. She gave him a small nod. He blinked, then dipped his eyes back to the headlines. After a moment, the waitress came over. "Afternoon, can I get you something to drink?" Her voice was polite, but carried a hint of hesitation. Maybe Talia didn't look like the regulars, or maybe the waitress wasn't used to women wearing well-pressed shirts, but no makeup in a place like this. Talia offered a gentle smile. "Coffee, black please," Talia said. "And water." She'd had a long drive, 2 hours from the city into the heart of this small county, where her company's proposal for a cutting-edge research lab was stirring both excitement and suspicion. Some saw her investment as a lifeline for a struggling rural economy. Others whispered about property values and who might be pushed out. When all the money came rolling in, Talia's firm had a track record of inclusive development, educational outreach, and scholarships. She believed in building from the ground up, but she'd learned the hard way that belief alone didn't erase centuries of mistrust. The waitress nodded and left to fetch the drinks. Outside, A sedan pulled up, and a county official, someone from the planning committee maybe, stepped out, fussing with his tie as he approached the diner. Talia watched through the window's reflection as he paused at the door, squinting in at her before entering. He was a middle-aged white man, slim, with a perpetual look of mild inconvenience etched into his face. She recognized him. James Browning, if her memory served. He'd introduced himself at the initial hearing last month, shaking her hand a bit too hard and calling her Ms. Carter in a way that sounded more like little lady. It had taken all her composure not to correct him right there. She was Dr. Carter, after all, with a PhD in biochemical engineering. But Talia wasn't one to pull rank unless absolutely necessary. The bells on the door jingled again as Browning stepped inside, hat in hand, scanning the room. Spotting Talia, he ambled over. "Hope you haven't been waiting too long," he said, sliding into the seat opposite her without asking. He placed his hat on the seat next to him. Talia pressed her lips into a polite line. "Not at all, I just got here," she replied evenly. She gestured to the other side of the booth. "I took the liberty of ordering coffee. Would you like some?" He waved a hand dismissively. No, I prefer tea, if they have it, that is." His voice had that twang of local familiarity, a subtle sign of territorial comfort. He cleared his throat. "So Dr. Carter, I hear you've got some big plans for our little town." Talia nodded slowly. "I think Greenbridge County has a lot of potential. The research center we're proposing would bring in stable jobs, training programs, scholarships for local kids to get into STEM fields. We believe in investing in the community." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "People around here like the sound of jobs, sure, but some are worried. Change can be tricky." The waitress returned, placing Talia's coffee and water on the table. Browning asked for tea, hot water and a tea bag if possible, and the waitress hurried off. Talia took a sip of her coffee. It was strong and bitter, not her usual gourmet blend, but it warmed her nonetheless. "Change always brings questions," Talia said after swallowing. "I'm happy to answer as many as I can. Transparency is important to me and to my firm." Browning sniffed, glancing at the farmers and truckers as if seeking silent backup. "You might find that not everyone's as open-minded about your project as you hope. Folks value tradition. They like to know who's in charge and that those folks understand our ways." Talia let that settle for a moment. She understood the subtext. "Are you one of us? Can you fit into our unspoken rules?" The unspoken code of belonging often came down to race, money, and history. She'd faced it before. City councils who expected her to be the administrative assistant rather than the CEO. Potential partners who assumed the black woman shaking their hand was part of the outreach team, and not the decision-maker. She'd learned to navigate these currents gracefully. "I respect tradition," Talia said softly, "and I value local knowledge. That's why I wanted to talk here, not in some corporate boardroom. If we move forward, I intend to partner with local leaders, from the community college to the farmers' cooperative. We want to understand the heart of this place." Browning's eyes narrowed, though he tried to hide it by picking up the sugar dispenser and fiddling with it. "All well and good. But let's talk specifics. My constituents want to know what kind of research you'll be doing. Biotech, right? Some folks worry about chemicals in the groundwater or GMOs creeping into our crops. They've heard stories." Talia nodded, taking another sip of coffee. "Our research focuses on sustainable biofuels and advanced medicinal compounds derived from local flora. We're talking laboratory work that's fully contained, no open-air testing without stringent safety measures. We've got a track record. 0 major incidents at our other facilities. In fact, our labs have won awards for ecological responsibility." The waitress returned with Browning's tea, just a tea bag and a mug of hot water. He eyed it skeptically, then dunked the bag with slow deliberation. "You understand, of course, that we'll need thorough documentation of all that, the environmental impact studies, the safety protocols. We can't just take your word for it." "Of course." Talia's voice was serene, as if talking to a cautious client rather than a suspicious gatekeeper. "I've brought copies of our initial environmental assessment. The full report will be ready next month, and we'll share that too." As if on cue, she reached into her shoulder bag, a sleek but durable canvas tote, nothing fancy, and pulled out a slim folder. When she tried to hand it over, Browning hesitated for a beat too long, as if even touching her documents might signal some concession on his part. Finally, he took it, flipping through the pages with perfunctory glances. It was at that moment the diner's door opened once more, admitting a swirl of dusty wind and another figure. A woman in a neat blazer and sensible shoes. She carried a stack of flyers. Talia recognized her. Sarah Ung, the local community organizer who'd supported Talia's proposal at the preliminary hearing, citing the economic boost and educational opportunities it could bring. Sarah paused at the threshold, noticed Talia and Browning in conversation, and offered a cautious smile. Browning stiffened. "Looks like your fan club is here," he muttered, sliding out of the booth. He stood up, leaving the file on the table. "I'll review these documents. We have a council meeting next week. Don't be surprised if we call you in for more questioning." He said it like a warning, his voice a shade quieter now that Sarah watched. Then he nodded curtly and ambled off toward the exit, leaving his tea barely touched. Talia sat back, exhaling. She knew what this meant. The path ahead wasn't going to be smooth. She'd have to prove herself again and again. Not just with data and promises, but with steady resolve. She'd have to navigate the currents of local politics and the subtle prejudices that flowed under the surface, like groundwater seeping through old pipes. Sarah approached, sliding into the booth opposite Talia, where Browning had just been. "How'd it go?" she asked, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Her voice was warm, like a friend checking in rather than a political ally. Talia offered a small, wry smile. "He took the documents, he listened. That's something, I suppose?" Sarah nodded, scanning the faces in the diner. A couple of the patrons had gone back to their meals, but a few still watched out of the corners of their eyes, curious about this black CEO and her intentions for their town. In the background, the country music continued at a low hum, as if nothing unusual were happening. But Talia could feel the tension, like a subtle pulse in the air. "Well," Sarah said, "just know you've got support from folks who are ready for something new. We're tired of being overlooked out here. They'll test you, but once they see you're for real, I think you'll have a fighting chance." Talia looked out the window, across the highway to the patchy fields beyond. The sun was dipping lower now, and soon the sky would be painted in streaks of orange and purple. She raised her coffee mug, took one more sip, and squared her shoulders. "I appreciate that," she said. "And I'm ready for it." Outside, a semi-truck roared past, and inside Dolly's kitchen, the quiet struggle for understanding continued. Talia felt the first delicate tremors of what would become a quake of change. She had chosen to meet them where they were, in a place with frayed vinyl booths and flickering neon signs, to show that she respected their world. Whether they respected her in return remained to be seen. But Talia Carter had built an empire on determination and empathy, and she wouldn't abandon those tools now. She set her coffee mug down gently, the ceramic clink echoing softly against the formica table. "Let's talk strategy," she said to Sarah, leaning in, ready to plan her next moves. Talia and Sarah parted ways in the diner's parking lot, each promising to reconvene later in the week. The sky had deepened to a warm amber hue, and the rural quiet was punctured only by the occasional rush of a passing truck. Talia slipped into her Tesla, tapping the screen to check the route to her small rental cottage on the outskirts of town. The car hummed softly as it pulled back onto the road, heading toward the main street where a handful of shops and municipal buildings clustered around a dusty intersection. She planned to drop by the county clerk's office before it closed. Maybe she could leave an extra copy of the environmental documents so the council members had no excuses about misplaced paperwork. She'd learned long ago that preparedness was armor. But as she guided the car down the main street, really more of a wide lane flanked by old brick storefronts and angle-parked pickups, she noticed a police cruiser parked near the corner, its occupant eyeing her sleek vehicle as it rolled by. Ignoring the prickling feeling at the back of her neck, Talia found a spot in front of the courthouse steps. She stepped out, tugging her blouse straight, and retrieved the folder from her tote. Just as she turned, she saw the reflection of blue and red lights in the courthouse's glass doors. The cruiser had pulled up behind her car, and an officer, broad-shouldered and wearing mirrored sunglasses even as dusk approached, emerged slowly. Talia forced herself to remain calm. There was no reason for him to stop her. She was parked legally, the plates were current, and she wasn't doing anything wrong. "Ma'am," the officer called, his voice carrying that tone of detached authority. He approached with one hand resting on his utility belt. "Is this your vehicle?" Talia took a steadying breath. "Yes, officer, it is. Is there a problem?" The officer's gaze drifted over her, from her neatly pinned hair to her practical shoes. She saw the moment his eyes flicked to the Tesla's custom plates, just her company's initials, and back to her face. "We don't see many cars like that around here," he said, not smiling. His drawl was thicker than Browning's, more clipped. "Mind telling me what brings you to Greenbridge County?" Talia's heart thumped once in irritation. She kept her voice level. "I'm here on business. I have a meeting with the county council." She stepped slightly to the side, giving him a clear view of the courthouse behind her. "Just dropping off some documents." The officer's jaw tightened. "I see you got some ID on you." She nearly sighed out loud. It was a subtle humiliation, asking for ID for no discernible reason. She knew better than to protest too strongly. From experience, she understood how fragile the balance was. So, Talia reached calmly into her tote and produced her driver's license, handing it over with a neutral expression. He studied it for longer than necessary, flipping it front to back, then glanced between the license and her face. "And you say you're here to meet the council?" he said finally, as if the notion that she could be conducting official business was inherently suspect. "I've already met one of them at Dolly's," she said with measured politeness. "James Browning, I'm Dr. Talia Carter, CEO of Carter Innovations. We're considering opening a research facility here." She found herself adding extra credentials, hoping to short-circuit whatever narrative he might be building in his mind, that she was an outsider, suspicious, unwelcome. A pause. Then the officer handed back her license. "A research facility, huh?" He didn't apologize for the stop. Instead, he took a step closer, as if evaluating her for signs of dishonesty. "Well, Dr. Carter, guess folks are talking about it. Just be mindful of where you park and what you're up to. Folks here are cautious about strangers, especially ones who look out of place." Out of place. She swallowed the sting of that remark and forced a calm nod. "Noted, officer. Have a good evening." He didn't respond, just watched as she turned and climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the county clerk's office was lit with fluorescent lights that hummed softly. A tall, thin clerk with wire-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter, tapping at a computer keyboard. Talia approached, folder in hand, doing her best to shake off the tension from the encounter outside. "Hi there," she began pleasantly. "I'm here to drop off additional documents related to Carter Innovations' proposed research center. These are for the council's upcoming review session. Could I leave them with you?" The clerk stopped typing but didn't look up right away. His name tag read, Alan. After a moment, he gave her a glance, eyes sweeping over her folder, her face, then drifting back to the screen as if unimpressed. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked. Talia's brow furrowed slightly. "I believe so. The council meets here, correct?" She kept her tone cordial, refusing to rise to the bait. "Yeah, council meets in the chamber down the hall," Alan said, finally looking her in the eye. "But they don't usually take drop-offs after hours." It was barely past 6:09 p.m., and the sign on the door said they closed at 7. She doubted 1 hour made a big difference. "These are time-sensitive," Talia explained. "I met with Mr. Browning today, and he requested additional documentation. I'd like them on file so there's no delay." She pushed the folder forward slightly on the counter. Alan pursed his lips. "Mr. Browning requested them personally?" "Not explicitly," Talia said, carefully choosing her words. "But he indicated he'd be reviewing more documents. I want to ensure he and the rest of the council have what they need." Alan sighed, as if burdened by her presence. "Fine, I'll put them in his mailbox, but I can't promise he'll look at them in time." "Thank you," Talia said, infusing her voice with warmth, even though her patience frayed at the edges. She watched as Alan took the folder reluctantly, placing it on a side desk with exaggerated carelessness, as if it were something distasteful. She stepped outside into the cooling air. The police cruiser was still there, the officer leaning against it, arms folded, watching her. She pretended not to notice, heading back to her car. Her hands tightened on the door handle before she slipped inside. Her chest felt heavy. She thought of her board members who had encouraged her to pick Greenbridge County, a place sorely in need of economic revitalization. She thought of the young students who might one day intern at her facility. She thought of the potential breakthroughs in sustainable fuel that could come from this partnership. All of it felt distant now, drowned out by suspicion and resistance. The Tesla's autopilot guided her down a side street toward the rental cottage she'd arranged for her stay. She needed a quiet evening to plan her next moves. As she pulled into the short gravel driveway, beside a modest, single-story house, she noticed the neighbor across the fence, a middle-aged woman watering her garden. The woman paused, hose in hand, staring openly at Talia as she parked. Talia tried a small smile, but the neighbor turned abruptly away, as if offended by her presence. Inside the cottage, dim lamplight cast soft shadows on rustic wood furniture. She set her tote on the kitchen table and let herself breathe. The tension in her shoulders had formed knots. She sat down and took her phone from her pocket, contemplating whether to call Sarah or just unwind alone. Before she could decide, her screen lit up with a message from Sarah. "Any trouble after I left? Heard the clerk's office can be tough. Let me know if you need help." Talia typed a quick response, summing up the encounter with the officer and the clerk in a few careful sentences. She ended with, "I'm okay. Just frustrated." Almost immediately, Sarah replied, "I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Let's strategize tomorrow. This is exactly why we need you here." Talia smiled faintly. Sarah's support felt like a lifeline. She stood, looking out at the evening sky through the cottage's front window. Tomorrow, she'd tour a potential building site and maybe talk to a local journalist who wanted her perspective. But tonight, she let the frustration wash over her. She couldn't afford to show anger in public. People like Browning, the officer, and the clerk would seize on it, label her difficult or aggressive. So she'd keep it bottled up, let it simmer until she found a constructive way to release it. The next morning, Talia rose early. Over a simple breakfast of toast and fruit, she reviewed her notes and planned her day. She'd arranged to meet a local reporter, Miriam Green, at a small coffee shop next to a hardware store. Miriam had reached out after the initial hearing, wanting Talia's side of the story before the council voted. Perhaps gaining more positive media coverage would help counter the hostile narrative forming behind closed doors. She arrived at the coffee shop at 8:30. The place was quiet. A few retirees chatting softly, a young couple splitting a muffin. Miriam spotted her and waved from a corner table. She was a petite woman in her 30s, her brown hair tied back neatly, a pen tucked behind one ear, and a notepad on the table. "Talia, thanks for coming," Miriam said, smiling warmly. "I appreciate your time. I know things have been tense." "Thanks for inviting me," Talia responded, returning the smile. "I'm hoping to clear the air." They settled into a conversation, Miriam asking thoughtful questions about the research center's mission, potential community partnerships, and what safeguards would be in place. Talia answered honestly, painting a picture of mutual benefit and long-term investment. The atmosphere felt calmer here, more open. Just as Talia began to relax, the door swung open, and a man in a uniform strolled in. Another local officer, different from last night's. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering when it landed on Talia. He took his coffee to go, but not before giving her a once-over that made her skin prickle. Miriam noticed and frowned slightly. "That's Officer Garland," Miriam whispered after he left. "He's not a bad guy, but folks around here get curious when someone new's in town, especially someone trying to make big changes." Talia nodded, sipping her coffee. "I'm noticing that I expected questions, but not this level of suspicion." Miriam's expression softened. "I'm sorry, I know it's different for you than it would be for someone else. The talk around town, some people are just old-fashioned, stuck in their ways. They see a black woman in a position of power, and they start, well, making unfair assumptions." Talia appreciated Miriam's directness. "It's frustrating," she admitted quietly. "My record speaks for itself, my company's reputation is strong, but here, none of that seems to matter." Miriam sighed, tapping her notepad thoughtfully. "I can include your comments on these barriers in my article, maybe if people hear it directly." Before Miriam could finish, the door burst open again, and this time it was Browning entering, looking frazzled. He spotted Talia and Miriam together, surprise flickering across his face. He approached their table, voice raised a notch too loud. "Dr. Carter, I didn't realize you'd be talking to the press so soon. We haven't finalized anything yet, you know." Miriam stood, pen in hand. "Just an informal interview, Mr. Browning." She's explaining her intentions, which I think the community deserves to hear. Browning's eyes narrowed. "Well, I hope you're not misrepresenting anything. The council is still reviewing matters, don't want folks getting the wrong impression." Talia felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm simply being transparent. People want facts, I'm sharing them," he huffed, adjusting his tie. "Sure, facts." He gave Miriam a pointed look before turning back to Talia. "By the way, I got your documents. Interesting reading, I must say. We'll see if it addresses all the council's concerns." The subtext was clear. He was asserting control, reminding her that he held the power to accept or reject her proposal. Miriam glanced between them, scribbling something down, capturing the tension in shorthand. When Browning left, the coffee shop's quiet resumed. Talia exhaled and offered Miriam an apologetic smile. "Sorry for the interruption." Miriam just shook her head. "No need to apologize, I see the resistance you're up against." She tapped her pen on the notepad. "I'll do my best to present a fair picture, but I can't promise everyone will suddenly change their minds." Talia understood that. She thanked Miriam for her time and stepped outside into the morning sun. The day was still young, but the weight of prejudice pressed heavily. Every interaction felt like a small battle in a larger war. If the council rejected her proposal, this community would lose out on an opportunity she genuinely believed would help them. But how could she get them to see past their biases and understand that her presence wasn't a threat? As she crossed the street toward her car, she noticed the hardware store's manager watching her through the window. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared, shoulders tense, as if unsure whether to open the door. Talia pretended not to notice, got into her Tesla, and turned on the engine's quiet hum. She had appointments to keep and people to convince, but doubt lingered in her mind. Would any amount of logic and goodwill overcome this climate of suspicion? She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, steadying herself. She would remain calm, professional, unwavering. She'd show them who she truly was through her actions, through patience and perseverance. Yet beneath that calm facade, anger smoldered. Anger at being forced to prove her worthiness again and again. Anger at the small slights that chipped away at her dignity. Anger, too, at the knowledge that letting that anger show could ruin everything. Pressing the accelerator lightly, Talia pulled away, determined to press on, to give this place every chance. But the tension now was unmistakable. Pressure building, frustration mounting. She knew a breaking point lay ahead, a moment when the simmering conflict would boil over. For now, she braced herself, heart heavy, but resolve intact, preparing for whatever came next. Talia hadn't imagined the county council meeting would draw such a crowd. Yet here it was, late afternoon in the old community hall, and every folding chair was filled. Some folks stood along the back wall, arms crossed, murmuring to each other. The air crackled with a nervous energy. Word had spread that Carter innovations would be discussed tonight, and not in the polite, measured tones Talia had hoped for. The large windows overlooked a dusty parking lot, where pickup trucks and a single TV news van huddled together. The smell of stale coffee and old wood lingered, and on the stage sat a long table of council members, including Browning, who refused to meet Talia's eyes as she took her seat in the front row. Sarah had saved it for her, and the organizer gave Talia a reassuring nod. Today, Talia wore a muted gray suit, as if armor might come in the form of tailored fabric. At her feet rested a slim briefcase containing more documents, letters of recommendation, and data sets. She'd left nothing to chance. The meeting began with formalities. The council chair, an older woman named Ruth Coleman, clearing her throat before introducing the main agenda item, reviewing Carter Innovations' proposal for the research facility. She did so with a clipped tone, as if itching to reach the more contentious part. Talia noticed Officer Garland and the other officer from before, positioned near the hall's exit, eyes scanning the crowd. Their presence felt less like security and more like intimidation. Browning rose to speak first. "Before we move forward with any vote," he said, voice projecting, "it's important we have full clarity on the potential risks of this project. He shot a quick glance at Talia, then addressed the audience. Some concerns have been raised about the accuracy of the environmental impact data provided to us. We must ensure there's no deception here. A ripple passed through the crowd. Talia stiffened. She had provided everything requested. More, even. And the data was solid. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "They're trying to sow doubt. Stay calm." Talia nodded, knuckles whitening around the edge of her briefcase. "I have additional copies of the reports," Talia said, standing and addressing the council. She kept her voice steady. "They've been independently verified, and I'm happy to walk you through any part that's unclear." Browning frowned. "We appreciate that, Dr. Carter, but we've recently received conflicting information." He paused dramatically. "We have an anonymous tip suggesting some of the data may have been altered." Talia's heart stumbled. Altered data. She had never falsified anything. She exchanged a bewildered look with Sarah. From the side of the hall, Miriam the reporter raised her eyebrows, taking rapid notes. Talia saw the quick flash of the TV camera's red light. The stakes had just skyrocketed. "Is there any proof of this accusation?" Talia asked, fighting to keep her tone calm. She wanted to shout that this was absurd, but anger would only fuel their narrative. Browning cleared his throat and waved a stack of papers. "We're still reviewing these documents. Let's call it an ongoing investigation." An uneasy hush settled in. This was a trap, cast suspicion without evidence, force Talia to defend herself, and watch her credibility wilt under the spotlight. Talia inhaled slowly. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "I welcome a full review of our data," she said, voice resonant. "My team and I have never misrepresented anything. Every figure is backed by third-party audits. We can supply contact information for those auditors." Ruth Coleman tapped her pen on the table. "We'll note your willingness to cooperate. For now, however, we need to address the community's worries. Some residents fear property values might be affected, and others are concerned about changes to the local labor market. We must be sure we can trust your company's word." The tension swelled. Talia recognized some faces from the diner, the hardware store. She caught a glimpse of the clerk, Alan, leaning against the wall with arms folded. Then she spotted Officer Daniels, the first officer who'd harassed her by the courthouse, standing beside Garland. Their eyes met, and Daniels smirked faintly, as if enjoying the show. Sarah stood. "I've spoken to Dr. Carter extensively," she began, voice firm. "She's brought verifiable credentials and a transparent plan. Let's not lose sight of what her facility could mean for jobs, education, and sustainability here. If there's a question about the data, let's verify it. But let's not throw baseless accusations." A few people murmured in agreement, but Browning pressed on. "With all due respect, Ms. Ung, we've got to be cautious. I'd hate to see our town misled by promises that can't be kept." Miriam raised her hand from the audience. "Mr. Browning, will the council provide the alleged contradictory documents to Dr. Carter's team for review? Transparency goes both ways." Browning hesitated, caught off guard. "In due time," he said. "Right now, we're still examining their authenticity." Talia nearly laughed at the irony. They were accusing her of falsification while refusing to show evidence of their own claim. Suddenly, a man in a flannel shirt and a John Deere cap stood up. "I want to know who this Dr. Carter really is," he said, voice loud. "She just rolls in from the city. How do we know she ain't got some shady investors behind her?" Rumbles of agreement filled the hall. Talia stepped forward. She could feel her pulse fluttering. "I'm willing to answer any questions about my background," she said. "My personal and professional records are public. I've worked with government agencies, NGOs, and have led successful projects in other communities." Another voice chimed in. "That's all on paper. How do we know it's true for us?" The frustration spiked inside Talia, and she pressed it down. She'd dealt with distrust before, but never so brazenly tied to her very identity. "Judge me by my work," she said, voice level. "Not by assumptions. If you have reservations, I'm here to address them." Browning smiled thinly. "That's exactly what we're doing." He glanced at the officers, who took a step closer to the front of the room. The air thickened. Was he planning some spectacle? Talia's mind raced. She considered her options. If they arrested her, or even detained her, on some fabricated charge, it would be a public humiliation. But maybe that was their angle. Force a scene, rattle her, make her look untrustworthy. She clenched her jaw, remembering the old lesson. A raised voice or a flash of anger could confirm their worst stereotypes. She had to remain poised, factual. But inside, her anger coiled like a tightened spring. Sarah noticed the officer's advance and placed herself beside Talia. "What's the meaning of this?" Sarah demanded, arms crossed. "There's no cause for police involvement. This is a council meeting." Officer Daniels stepped up to the microphone stand and cleared his throat. "We've had a report that certain official documents related to this project might have been tampered with. Until we clear that up, we might need to ask Dr. Carter some questions down at the station." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Miriam's pen froze, eyes wide. The reporter from the TV crew nudged his cameraman to zoom in. This was the moment they wanted. Talia, standing accused, singled out. Talia's heart hammered. This was overt hostility now. They had cornered her. If she refused to go, she'd look guilty. If she went, she'd be at their mercy. She glanced at Sarah, who gave her a desperate, apologetic look. She saw Miriam shaking her head in disbelief. Even Ruth Coleman frowned, though she did not intervene. "I have nothing to hide," Talia said, voice steady. "If answering your questions will clear this up, I'm willing. But this accusation is baseless, and I hope you understand the harm you're causing by entertaining it." Browning spread his hands. "We just want the truth, Dr. Carter." The crowd murmured again. Some looked ashamed, but others seemed eager for a confrontation. The tension was suffocating. Talia drew a slow breath and turned to face Officer Daniels. "I'll come with you, but I insist on contacting my legal counsel first." Daniels nodded curtly. "You can make a call at the station." There it was, the humiliating march out of the hall, in full view of everyone. But Talia stepped forward gracefully, refusing to show fear. Sarah touched her arm, whispering, "I'm so sorry." Miriam stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," the reporter said. "I'll be filing a story tonight." Browning's lips tightened at Miriam's words. Good, Talia thought. Let them face the scrutiny of the press. If she had to endure this injustice, she'd make sure the world knew it. "Just remember," Talia said quietly, meeting Browning's gaze before turning to follow the officers. "The truth will come out. I hope you're prepared for it." He looked uneasy but said nothing. The officers escorted Talia toward the exit, the crowd parting like a tide. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the spectacle. Others watched with morbid curiosity. Outside, dusk had fallen, and the TV crew hurried out to catch footage of Talia being led into the police cruiser. Before stepping in, Talia paused on the sidewalk, lifting her chin. This would not break her. She had come too far, achieved too much, to let this town's small-minded tactics defeat her. If they thought they could chase her away or tarnish her reputation, they had gravely underestimated her. She slid into the back seat of the cruiser, and as the door slammed shut, she saw Sarah rushing out of the hall, phone to her ear, probably calling lawyers or allies. She saw Miriam talking animatedly to the camera, likely condemning this turn of events. And in the rearview mirror, Officer Daniels adjusted his hat, satisfied, perhaps believing they'd cornered her. But Talia was already strategizing. Once at the station, she'd call her corporate attorneys, civil rights advocates, and possibly the state's regulators. She'd ensure that every detail of this sordid ploy was documented. If the council and the officers thought she'd fold under pressure, they would soon realize their mistake. By putting her in this impossible position, they'd only given her a stage to expose their biases and corruption. The cruiser pulled away from the community hall, taillights disappearing into the quiet street. The hum of the engine felt ominous, but inside, Talia's resolve burned bright. She would show them the strength beneath her calm exterior. If this was the path to truth and justice, she would walk it head-on, determined to turn this humiliation into a turning point that no one in Greenbridge County would soon forget. The police cruiser's interior was cramped and uncomfortable. The partition between Talia and the officers in the front seat made her feel caged, as if her every breath was being measured and judged. Outside, the small-town streets blurred past in streaks of dim light and shadow. The quiet roads, lined with darkened storefronts and sleepy porches, offered no comfort. The echoes of the town hall meeting still roared in her mind. Officer Daniels and his partner Garland spoke quietly up front. She couldn't make out their words, but she sensed their smug satisfaction. This was a power move, a staged performance. The successful CEO brought low in their jurisdiction, forced into submission. Talia's pulse thrummed in her ears. She considered what awaited her at the station: interrogation, accusations, and perhaps an attempt to coerce her into admitting something that wasn't true. But Talia Carter was not a woman who bowed easily to intimidation. She inhaled deeply, centering herself. She had allies: Sarah, the local organizer who had her back; Miriam, the reporter who'd witnessed the unfair spectacle; and her own legal team, a phone call away. The council and the officers might have stacked the deck, but Talia had truth on her side. They had given her the perfect story to shine a spotlight on the very biases she'd faced since arriving here. Now, she would turn their hostility into her evidence. The cruiser pulled into the gravel lot behind the sheriff's station. The building itself was squat and unassuming, lit by a single floodlight that cast harsh shadows. Daniels opened her door and motioned for her to get out. Talia stepped carefully onto the crunching gravel, back straight, head high. The late evening air had turned cool, but inside her chest, resolve burned bright. As they led her inside, the station's fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A bored-looking deputy glanced up from a desk and did a double-take. It was clear they weren't used to bringing in corporate executives dressed in tailored suits. Talia caught the deputy's confused stare and held it calmly. Let them wonder why she didn't seem frightened. "Have a seat," Daniels said curtly, directing her to a plastic chair by a small interview room. "We'll talk once we confirm some details." Talia sank onto the chair, placing her briefcase on her lap, arms folded over it. "I'd like to contact my attorney now," she said, voice steady. Garland pursed his lips. "We'll get to that," he said, making no move to help. Talia noted the tactic. Delay her access to counsel, keep her off balance. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of showing impatience. She pressed her lips together and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Every time Talia glanced toward the front desk, the deputy there looked away. The silence was thick, each second a test of her composure. Eventually, she cleared her throat. "Officer Daniels," she said evenly. "I've cooperated fully. I insist on making my phone call now." He emerged from a side room, arms crossed. "Fine," he said, as if granting a favor. He led her to a small office with a phone on the desk. "One call." He hovered at the door, watching her as if expecting some trick. Talia dialed her head legal counsel, Marianne Pierce, a woman of formidable intellect and unwavering principles. The call rang twice before Marianne answered. Talia spoke clearly, laying out the situation without trembling. When she ended the call, she offered no reaction, though relief flooded her veins. Marianne was outraged and promised immediate action. Good reinforcements were on the way. As Talia hung up, Daniels smirked. "Your lawyer coming to bail you out already?" Talia met his gaze. "My lawyer is coming to ensure your department respects my rights." She said it matter-of-factly. The flicker of annoyance in his eyes gave her a grim satisfaction. Garland stepped into the room. "We've been reviewing your documents, Dr. Carter. Care to explain why someone would send us an anonymous tip claiming your environmental data is doctored?" Talia maintained her composure. "I can't explain the actions of an anonymous tipster. I can only repeat that my data is accurate and has been third-party verified. You're free to contact the auditors yourself." She reached into her briefcase, slowly so they wouldn't overreact, and pulled out a card. "This is the auditing firm's number." Garland took the card, but didn't look at it. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This town doesn't need big-shot city folks coming in and telling us what to do, changing our way of life." So that's what this was really about. Talia locked eyes with Garland. "My project is about collaboration, not coercion," she said evenly. "I've never forced anyone to accept my proposal. I'm here because the county initially invited me to explore options. If your community decides against it, so be it. But that decision should be made on facts, not lies." She heard the soft creak of a door behind her. Turning slightly, she glimpsed Mitchell, the young deputy who'd been sitting at the desk, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. He looked troubled, like he hadn't signed up for this kind of intimidation. Talia remembered seeing him earlier, his eyes full of questions. Maybe he was one of those who could still be swayed by reason. Daniels noticed Mitchell too, and frowned. "What do you want?" he barked. Mitchell cleared his throat. "There's someone out front asking questions, Sarah Ung, and a reporter named Miriam Green. They're demanding to know why Dr. Carter was brought in. They said they'll go live on TV if we don't explain." Daniel's jaw tightened. Garland muttered something under his breath. Talia felt a surge of hope. Good. Let the public see this injustice. The officers thought they could operate in the shadows, but the cameras were rolling, and the world would watch. "Tell them it's a routine inquiry," Daniels snapped. Mitchell hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and slipped away. The tension between the officers deepened. They had counted on fear and silence, but now the press and a community advocate stood outside, shining a light on their maneuver. "It seems public scrutiny is making you uncomfortable," Talia said softly. "That's what happens when you detain someone without grounds. People start asking questions." Garland straightened his shoulders, ignoring her jab. "We have grounds. There's suspicion of fraudulent documents." Talia shook her head calmly. "Produce them. Let's see these alleged documents. Let's call in a neutral party to analyze them. I have nothing to hide." He glanced at Daniels, who stood with his back against the wall, silent. They had no real evidence. It was becoming clear that this was a bluff. Their plan had been to scare her, to tarnish her reputation, hoping she'd cut and run. Now they were cornered. Outside, muffled voices rose. Talia caught words like unjust and intimidation through the station's thin walls. She imagined Miriam broadcasting this standoff, Sarah rallying local supporters who might finally see through the council's tactics. Every second the officers delayed giving her an official reason for detention only strengthened Talia's hand. Mitchell returned, looking even more uneasy. "They're not leaving," he reported quietly to Daniels. "They say they'll contact state authorities." "State authorities?" Daniels hissed, eyes flashing with anger. "Who do they think they are?" Garland shoved his hands in his pockets. "Let's wrap this up," he muttered to Daniels. "We're risking too much." Talia seized the moment. "If you've realized this was a misunderstanding, I expect a prompt release and a public apology," she said, pressing her advantage. "I'm sure the news crew outside would appreciate some clarity." Daniels looked like he'd bitten into a lemon. "Don't push your luck." Talia rose to her full height, shoulders back. She'd suffered their intimidation, but no longer. "I'm not pushing luck, I'm stating facts. Detaining me without clear cause, refusing immediate counsel, spreading unfounded accusations, this is all on record now. If you don't end this charade, I'll see you and the council in court." A tense silence fell. Mitchell shifted from foot to foot, looking at the floor. Garland glanced at Daniels, his confidence wavering. Outside, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. The pressure was tangible, pressing into the station walls like a growing storm. Daniels finally moved, stepping toward Talia. His face contorted with frustration, but beneath it, Talia sensed a grudging respect, or maybe fear. "Fine," he said, voice tight. "You're free to go, but don't think this means we trust you." Talia inclined her head. "I'm not asking for your trust, only for fairness." She gathered her briefcase, heart pounding. She knew the fight wasn't over. They'd let her go to save face, but this battle had just escalated into a war for truth. Yet in this moment, she had won a critical round. As Mitchell escorted her out, he whispered, "I'm sorry." His voice was low, regretful. He looked ashamed of his colleagues. Talia gave him a small nod, acknowledging his humanity. Maybe he'd remember this day and question the system he worked for. The front door opened onto a scene of flashing camera lights and raised voices. Miriam hurried over, microphone in hand, Sarah at her side. A few onlookers, some she recognized from the meeting, stood around, their expressions conflicted. Talia stepped into the spotlight, the cool night air sharp and invigorating. Miriam's microphone hovered in front of her. "Dr. Carter, are you free to speak? What happened in there?" Talia took a breath. She wanted to shout her anger, to denounce the corruption, but she knew she had to remain composed. She had the community's attention now, and if she played this right, she could shift the narrative. "I was questioned without cause," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the darkened street. "Accusations were made without evidence, but I'm confident that my work, and my team's integrity, will withstand any scrutiny. We came to Greenbridge County to offer opportunity. Not to deceive. Tonight's events won't deter us from seeking the truth. In fact, they've only strengthened my resolve." Sarah put a hand on Talia's shoulder, solidarity and regret etched on her face. The cameras caught it all. The unjust attempt to undermine a black woman of power. The community's growing discomfort with their own leaders' tactics, and the quiet dignity with which Talia stood her ground. Behind her, through the glass doors of the station, Talia glimpsed Daniels and Garland watching. Their plan had backfired. Now the world would see them for what they were: enforcers of bias and intimidation. The council's smear attempt had only gifted Talia with a platform to expose the truth. A hush fell over the crowd, everyone waiting for what Talia would say next. She let the silence settle, then offered a gentle smile. "I'm ready to continue this conversation in a fair and open forum," she said. "We all deserve honesty and respect, and I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." As she said those words, Talia could feel the tide turning. The climax was near. In the next steps, she would confront Browning and his allies openly, using the media and legal avenues to reveal their machinations. The tension had reached its breaking point, and tomorrow, as the sun rose, a decisive confrontation would begin. It was the next morning, and Greenbridge County's main square thrummed with tension. Word had spread about last night's fiasco at the police station, and now a crowd had gathered under the hazy sunlight: farmers, small business owners, students, elders. Many had watched Miriam's footage on the local news or read the hastily posted updates online. They were curious, worried, and perhaps a bit ashamed. Talia stood at the steps of the old brick courthouse, flanked by Sarah and Miriam, waiting.